The household was a place of whispers, hidden glances, and unspoken comparisons. From the moment the protagonist awoke each day, she could feel the weight of neglect pressing against her. She moved through the halls quietly, carrying out her duties with precision, yet no one seemed to notice her efforts. Meals were prepared and served under her careful hands, garments mended and polished, rooms cleaned until they gleamed, but her presence went unacknowledged as if she were invisible, a shadow in her own home. Her stepsister, by contrast, seemed to walk in a halo of constant attention. Every gesture she made, every word she spoke, was met with admiration. The family laughed at her jokes, praised her accomplishments, and even the king, when he visited the household, appeared to favor her more than any other. The stepsister's charm was effortless, though not without a touch of vanity. She had learned early how to captivate, to tilt her head just so, to offer a polite smile that made others melt into compliance. And in this, the family indulged her entirely, rewarding her every success however small, while the protagonist's efforts, often far more meaningful, went unnoticed. The contrast was not subtle. At the breakfast table, the stepsister received the choicest portions, while the protagonist's plate was left bare in comparison. Compliments and words of encouragement flowed toward the favored girl, while the other's achievements were noted, if at all, in passing. She might fix a torn sleeve or sew a hem perfectly, and yet the praise would always land elsewhere. Even when she stumbled or showed hesitation in her tasks, the family hardly batted an eye. Her missteps were overlooked, her virtues ignored, and in this neglect, the tension grew. The protagonist watched her stepsister with quiet resentment, not born of malice but of a deep, aching sense of injustice. She could see the favoritism in every glance, every smile, and every word exchanged between her stepsister and those in positions of authority. The king, known for his keen eye and sharp mind, seemed entranced by her stepsister's grace, never noticing the patient diligence, the careful intelligence, and the quiet courage of the girl who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. The disparity gnawed at her, but she bore it silently, cultivating patience even as her heart burned with unspoken frustration. In private, she wrestled with these feelings. She questioned why the family could not see her worth, why the king could not recognize the quiet strength she embodied. Yet, she also understood the nature of envy and favoritism. It was not always the charm of the favored one alone, but also the blindness or weakness of those who chose to admire it. She resolved to continue her tasks with diligence, knowing that her integrity and patience were themselves forms of quiet power, though unseen by those who measured worth by applause and attention. The stepsister, keenly aware of her elevated position, often displayed her favor in subtle ways. She would boast of her interactions with the king, recounting every compliment and showing off trivial gifts or gestures bestowed upon her. Sometimes she would speak directly to the protagonist, veiling her mockery behind polite tones, her words dripping with subtle superiority. "Oh, don't worry," she might say, "I'm sure one day the king will notice your work, if it's good enough." The protagonist felt the sting of these words, each one a reminder of how deeply her labor and loyalty were overlooked. Yet, despite the resentment that simmered within her, the protagonist maintained a calm exterior. She did not lash out, did not allow anger to consume her. Instead, she used the tension as fuel, quietly observing, learning, and preparing herself for the moments when her patience and insight might turn the tables. She noticed patterns in the household, the way the stepsister manipulated conversations, the way servants and family members unconsciously sided with the one they admired. Every detail became a piece of understanding, a small map of the household's dynamics, which she memorized with careful attention. Among the staff and lesser members of the household, whispers circulated. Some admired her perseverance. Others, unsure of where to place themselves, remained silent. The stepsister's charm extended even to them, securing loyalty with a smile or small favor. And yet, in private moments, those who were observant could see the quiet dignity of the protagonist, how she carried herself with grace, how she spoke gently but firmly when required, how her eyes reflected intelligence and kindness even under the shadow of neglect. These qualities were invisible to the family, yet they were seeds of the respect she would one day earn. The tension between the sisters was a constant undercurrent, unspoken yet palpable. Each glance, each interaction carried the weight of competition and envy. The protagonist did not seek confrontation, yet her very composure contrasted sharply with the stepsister's theatrics, exposing the shallowness beneath charm and favoritism. Over time, this quiet strength began to accumulate as a form of unseen power, a force that, though ignored by those who valued appearance over substance, would eventually reveal itself in ways neither the family nor the stepsister could anticipate. And so, the household continued, a place of disparity and tension, of unseen virtue overshadowed by ostentatious favor. The protagonist endured, patient, observant and quietly resilient. She bore the neglect and favoritism without complaint, cultivating an inner strength that not only preserved her dignity but also set the stage for a reckoning that would one day balance the scales of justice in ways the household could not yet imagine. The protagonist had long grown accustomed to being overlooked, but nothing tested her patience quite like the subtle sabotage of her stepsister. It began with small things, a letter that seemed to vanish from her hands, a message that never reached her when it was clearly intended for her. At first she thought it might be error or oversight, the simple misplacement of inked pages in the bustle of the household. But soon patterns emerged, hints of an invisible hand deliberately at work. The letters she never received were from the king himself, full of instructions, praise and trust that could have elevated her position in the household. Each missing correspondence was a quiet dagger, its absence felt sharply in the spaces where opportunity had been denied. Her stepsister, ever aware of the power she wielded through charm and position, had learned of these letters through observation and cunning. She watched the protagonist's routine, noting the time she would collect messages, and memorized the paths she took to deliver them. In the shadows of the corridors she intercepted slips of paper as if by chance, tucking them away into hidden compartments, beneath floorboards or inside the folds of cushions. She smiled to herself afterward, imagining the frustration that would build within her stepsister, the confusion and doubt that would erode her composure. It was a silent war of deception, waged through the simplest of tools, parchment, ink and secrecy. The stepsister's cunning extended beyond mere hiding. She altered some letters slightly, changing names or instructions so that even if they were found, they would appear to be mistakes or miscommunications. In doing so, she ensured that any blame would fall upon the protagonist, subtly undermining her reputation while presenting herself as attentive, diligent, and trustworthy to the family and to the king. Each action was calculated, deliberate, and hidden beneath layers of politeness and apparent concern. She reveled in the power she felt, the knowledge that she controlled the flow of communication, the unseen threads that determined who would rise and who would stumble. Meanwhile, the protagonist remained largely unaware of the full extent of the scheme. She noticed discrepancies and delays, moments when the king's words seemed to vanish into thin air, and yet she could not pinpoint the cause. She blamed circumstances at first, the confusion of the household, the hurried hands of servants, or perhaps her own forgetfulness. Her mind, trained to observe and to reason, searched for explanations. Each missing letter became a puzzle, a riddle that teased her patience and demanded careful attention. The protagonist's diligence did not waver. She continued to check her tasks, ensuring that nothing on her end was left incomplete, never suspecting the malice hiding in plain sight. The household, caught between appearances and reality, provided little clarity. Servants and minor attendants, loyal to the stepsister in fear or admiration, turned a blind eye to her secret actions. Some recognized the unfairness but felt powerless to intervene. Others rationalized that the protagonist had perhaps misplaced or misread the correspondence. The stepsister's careful manipulation ensured that suspicion never fell upon her, weaving a web that was intricate, invisible, and nearly perfect. In private, the protagonist reflected on her growing unease. She felt the weight of expectations, of messages she could not deliver, and of the invisible hand that seemed to obstruct her at every turn. Still, she maintained her composure, aware that anger or accusation without proof would only play into her stepsister's hands. Her mind became a silent battlefield, filled with strategies to observe more closely, to detect patterns, and to gather knowledge without revealing her concern. Every misplaced letter, every subtle misdirection, was catalogued and remembered. Though she did not yet know the cause, she was preparing herself for the moment when the truth would emerge. The stepsister, emboldened by her success, took ever greater risks. She experimented with timing, intercepting letters at the very moment they left the king's hands, or slipping them from the protagonist's possession when she least expected it. She became skilled at moving unseen, leaving no trace of her interference. The household, immersed in daily routines, noticed nothing amiss. It was a delicate dance of deception, a game of patience and cunning where the stakes were influence, favor, and the subtle manipulation of destiny. Despite her schemes, the stepsister underestimated the quiet resilience of the protagonist. Her patience, observation, and keen perception began to sense irregularities. She noticed letters appearing in unexpected places, corners of the household where she had never left anything, and small hints of mischief that pointed toward intentional interference. She did not yet confront the truth, but her intuition stirred, like a faint wind warning of a storm on the horizon. Her intelligence, combined with her careful restraint, meant that when the stepsister eventually overstepped, the evidence would be undeniable. The letters themselves, fragile as they were, became symbols of this struggle. Each page carried not just ink and words but the tension between deceit and integrity, malice and patience. They were a silent testimony to the ongoing battle of wits within the household, and though the protagonist did not yet hold them, she had already begun to sense the contours of the deception. In her mind, she prepared for the day when the hidden correspondence would surface, confident that truth, like the wind, could not be held back forever. By the end of this phase, the stepsister's interference had reached its peak. She controlled every note, every message, and every slip of paper meant to bridge communication with the king. Yet, the protagonist's quiet observation, her methodical attention to detail, and her unwavering patience set the stage for a reckoning that would expose deceit and restore the rightful balance. The hidden letters were no longer merely a tool of sabotage, they had become the instruments of a moral lesson, waiting for the right moment to deliver justice in a manner both surprising and inevitable. The protagonist had long moved through the household with quiet diligence, performing her duties without complaint, and she had grown accustomed to being overlooked. Yet, recently she could no longer ignore the subtle disruptions that seemed to shadow her every action. Letters that should have arrived from the king did not reach her hands. Instructions, once clear and timely, appeared delayed or misdirected. These small discrepancies, almost imperceptible to others, began to gnaw at her sense of order and fairness. At first, she dismissed them as simple accidents, misplaced papers, hurried servants, or the ordinary chaos of a busy household. But as days turned into weeks, the pattern became undeniable. Something was amiss. Her observations were careful and methodical. She began noting the time each letter should have arrived, comparing it to when she actually received any correspondence. Pages she knew had been written by the king never reached her, while other mundane notes, completely unrelated to her duties, seemed to appear without fail. She kept these discrepancies in her mind, cataloging them silently. Her patience was not born of naivety, it was a deliberate restraint, a conscious choice to avoid hasty conclusions. She understood that accusation without evidence could backfire, especially in a household rife with favoritism and cunning. Small clues presented themselves in subtle ways. Occasionally she would see a flicker of movement in the corridors when no one should have been there, or a shadow pass where none should have existed. She noticed letters slightly out of place, corners creased or edges bent as if handled secretly. There were hints in the servant's behavior too, furtive glances, nervous shifts of weight, subtle hesitations when asked about missing documents. These small, almost imperceptible signs coalesced into a web of suspicion, pointing toward deliberate interference rather than mere accident. Despite her growing awareness, the protagonist maintained an outward calm. She carried herself with the same poise and diligence as always, performing her duties meticulously, never revealing the turbulence of her mind. She did not allow anger or frustration to cloud her judgment. Instead, she became more observant, more attuned to the nuances of her environment. Every sound, every misplaced item, every unusual glance became a piece of information. Her patience became a tool, enabling her to gather evidence without revealing her suspicions to the stepsister or the household at large. The stepsister, confident in her schemes, continued her subtle sabotage, unaware that the protagonist's keen perception had begun to detect irregularities. She moved stealthily, intercepting letters and manipulating communication, believing herself untouchable. Yet each small act of cunning left traces that the protagonist quietly observed. She noticed the unusual warmth of freshly touched paper, the faint scent of perfume left on envelopes that had not passed through her hands, and the timing of certain notes' disappearance. Though none of these clues alone were conclusive, together they painted a clear picture of intentional interference. In her private moments, the protagonist reflected on the situation with careful reasoning. She considered the motivations behind the missing letters, the patterns of favoritism in the household, and the personality of her stepsister. It became increasingly evident that the stepsister, in her desire for advantage and recognition, had actively sought to sabotage her. But rather than confronting her immediately, the protagonist chose patience. She understood that hasty action could be misinterpreted, and that proving intentional deceit required evidence. Her restraint was not weakness, it was strategic, a silent preparation for the moment when the truth could no longer be denied. The household itself offered more clues than anyone realized. Other members, though loyal to the favored stepsister in fear or admiration, occasionally left hints of the disruption. A servant might mutter a misdirected word under their breath or frown briefly when asked about a missing note. A page might hesitate before handing over correspondence, subconsciously aware that something was being hidden. The protagonist observed these micro-expressions, cataloging them like a careful scholar piecing together a puzzle. Each subtle reaction strengthened her understanding that the disruption was intentional, and that it originated from someone with access and motive. Someone close, someone she had long known too well. As the days passed, her suspicions solidified into a quiet certainty. She no longer questioned whether the interference was accidental. She understood that her stepsister was orchestrating a deliberate scheme. Yet she did not reveal this knowledge. Her eyes, always calm and composed, hid the fire of awareness within. She continued to fulfill her responsibilities, meticulously gathering evidence while maintaining the appearance of ignorance. Her careful attention extended to the smallest details: the way letters were folded, the faint impressions left on envelopes, the precise timing of each intercepted message. Every anomaly was noted, every irregularity remembered. The tension between the sisters, once subtle, became charged with unseen currents. Though the stepsister remained unaware of being observed, she began to sense a shift in her sister's composure. The protagonist's silence, her continued patience, was unsettling. Whereas before she had seemed oblivious and powerless, she now moved with purpose and awareness that hinted at latent power. The stepsister could not yet identify the source of this strength, and her confidence began to falter, though she masked it well in front of others. By the end of this period, the protagonist had transformed her suspicion into a quiet, methodical understanding. She knew the letters were being hidden, and she had begun to track the subtle patterns of the interference. Her patience, intelligence, and calm observation were preparing her for the moment when she could confront the deception. She would not act rashly. Instead, she would allow the web of intrigue to unfold fully, ensuring that the truth would emerge clearly and unmistakably. And in this silence, this careful watchfulness, the protagonist's quiet power was already beginning to assert itself, shaping the course of events in ways the stepsister could neither anticipate nor control. As the days progressed, the stepsister's schemes became increasingly audacious. No longer content with merely intercepting letters or delaying correspondence, she sought to manipulate every situation so that blame would fall squarely on the protagonist. She timed her interventions with meticulous precision, ensuring that the smallest errors, even those entirely beyond her sister's control, would appear as negligence or incompetence. Each act was carefully orchestrated, designed not only to elevate her own status but to sow confusion and mistrust in the household. It began with simple tasks. If the protagonist was assigned to prepare a room for an important guest, the stepsister would subtly misplace supplies or alter instructions, guaranteeing that the setup would seem incomplete or improper. When the household noticed the flaw, it was the protagonist who received questioning glances and subtle reproach, while the stepsister maintained a facade of helpfulness and diligence. Her timing was flawless. Every misstep of the protagonist became a stage for the stepsister's carefully rehearsed performance, leaving observers convinced that the errors were the result of carelessness rather than intentional sabotage. The letters, already a source of quiet frustration, now became instruments of deliberate blame. The stepsister would occasionally allow a correspondence to reach the protagonist only partially, altering critical details or erasing a line that contained instructions. When outcomes did not align with expectations, the protagonist would be the obvious culprit. Every miscommunication was magnified, every oversight exaggerated, and the stepsister's role remained invisible. Her subtle manipulations spread a creeping tension through the household, leaving the protagonist under constant scrutiny without her ever knowing who was truly responsible. The protagonist, perceptive as she was, began to notice these patterns, though she still lacked full proof. She observed that tasks which should have proceeded smoothly were repeatedly met with unexpected complications. Items were missing or altered in ways that could not be attributed to mere chance. And yet, even as she noted these anomalies, she remained composed. She understood that reacting hastily or accusing others without evidence would only serve the stepsister's purpose. Patience, she realized, was her strongest weapon. By watching, listening, and cataloging every irregularity, she would eventually uncover the truth. The household atmosphere grew tense. Servants whispered among themselves, confused by the apparent incompetence of the protagonist, while simultaneously admiring the stepsister's seeming efficiency. Even the head of the household or visiting officials began to cast skeptical glances at the protagonist, believing the errors to be genuine lapses rather than orchestrated sabotage. Every misattributed mistake added pressure, yet the protagonist endured, quietly correcting errors and completing her responsibilities with unwavering diligence. Her restraint only made the stepsister bolder, emboldened by the apparent success of her schemes. At times, the stepsister would employ subtle psychological tactics. She would speak softly to the protagonist, offering advice or concern, masking thinly veiled accusations within words of apparent kindness. "I'm sure the king will be displeased if this is not handled correctly," she might say, tilting her head in mock sympathy. The protagonist felt the sting of these insinuations but held herself steady, refusing to allow anger to surface. Each of these manipulations served a dual purpose: to unsettle the protagonist and to demonstrate to observers that she was incapable of managing her duties effectively. The stepsister's efforts extended even to the letters themselves. She would selectively reveal certain correspondences to other members of the household, presenting them in ways that implied the protagonist had neglected or misread them. One letter, carefully placed on a table in full view of a servant, suggested a failed task or misunderstood instruction. Another, strategically left open, implied negligence in handling important matters. The stepsister's careful orchestration ensured that no one would suspect her involvement, while every misstep appeared to be the protagonist's fault. Meanwhile, the protagonist continued her quiet vigilance. She noted every irregularity, every subtle sign of interference, and stored this knowledge in her mind. She began tracking patterns, recognizing the timing and circumstances under which tasks were sabotaged. Each clue was catalogued carefully, like pieces of a larger puzzle. Though she did not yet confront the stepsister, she was already preparing for a moment when the truth could no longer be concealed. Her patience was strategic. She understood that a direct accusation too soon would fail to convince others and might even result in further injustice. The tension in the household became almost palpable. Whispered conversations halted when the protagonist entered a room, servants glanced nervously at her, and even the stepsister's supporters began to sense the growing presence of silent strength behind her composed demeanor. Though the protagonist remained outwardly calm, her internal focus sharpened. Every scheme of the stepsister was a test of her resilience, a challenge to her ability to maintain dignity and composure under pressure. Despite the mounting difficulties, the protagonist did not falter. She continued to perform her duties flawlessly wherever possible, ensuring that no true mistake could be laid at her feet. Her quiet competence, though unrecognized by some, was steadily building a foundation of credibility that would one day expose the stepsister's deceit. The tension in the household, while heavy, became a crucible in which her patience, intelligence, and moral clarity were tempered, preparing her for the moment when hidden schemes would finally be revealed. By the end of this period, the stepsister's plots had reached their height, creating the maximum amount of tension, suspicion, and drama. Every delay, every misplaced letter, every manipulated instruction seemed to point toward the protagonist's failure, and yet her calm observation and patient endurance made her impervious to the immediate consequences. The household, unaware of the true manipulations at play, was caught in a web of intrigue that only the protagonist fully understood. Her silence, patience, and diligence were slowly turning the tide, setting the stage for a revelation that would expose the stepsister's treachery and restore justice in a manner that would be remembered for. As the household descended deeper into tension and miscommunication, a strange presence began to make itself known, a wind that seemed more than a mere breeze, carrying with it a subtle awareness of the injustices swirling within the walls. It was not loud or forceful, nor did it announce itself with a roar. Instead, it whispered, curling through the corridors in quiet swirls, rustling curtains, shifting papers, and brushing against the edges of furniture in a way that drew attention without frightening anyone outright. The protagonist first noticed it one morning as she gathered letters and notices scattered about the workroom. A delicate breeze moved through the room, lifting a parchment that had been carefully hidden under a stack of cloth, revealing it momentarily in the soft light. She did not yet understand its significance, but she felt the gentle brush of justice in the air, subtle and undeniable. The stepsister, as usual, remained oblivious. She continued her schemes with confidence, intercepting letters, creating false impressions of negligence, and manipulating those around her. Yet even she could not ignore the occasional oddities, the sudden gust that scattered her carefully arranged papers, the inexplicable chill that passed over her when she touched a letter that had been moved without her knowledge. At first, she dismissed these occurrences as coincidence, perhaps the natural movement of air through the household or her own imagination. But as these incidents became more frequent, a creeping unease settled within her. Something unseen was observing, responding, and perhaps even anticipating her actions. The wind did not act in overtly dramatic ways at first. It nudged letters just enough to reveal partial truths, or carried the faint scent of ink and paper to alert the protagonist that something had been disturbed. It whispered through the rafters and beneath doors, a soft, almost melodic sound that seemed to murmur warnings to the one who would listen. The protagonist, attuned to subtle signals from the environment, began to notice these cues. A letter would flutter across the floor as if seeking her attention. A curtain would sway at a precise moment, revealing an unnoticed detail of the room. She began to sense that the wind was more than natural. It was deliberate, purposeful, and aligned with her unseen struggle for fairness. The household, caught up in the everyday routines and the visible tension between the sisters, remained largely unaware of this mysterious presence. Servants passed through corridors, oblivious to the gentle currents that shifted papers and whispered through the halls. The stepsister moved confidently, never suspecting that her manipulations were being subtly undermined. Yet each intercepted letter, each misdirected note, was now at risk of exposure. The wind, silent and persistent, seemed to favor the innocent, nudging them toward discovery and clarity. The protagonist's awareness of this force grew slowly. She began to notice the patterns of movement, the timing of the small disturbances, and the precise moments when letters she suspected to be hidden were revealed. It was as if the wind itself understood her plight, guiding her without interference, creating opportunities for her to observe the truth. Her heart felt a quiet reassurance in these moments, a sense that justice, though unseen, was not absent. She did not yet know the full extent of the wind's abilities, nor did she understand its source, but she trusted its presence, allowing it to guide her patient vigilance. Sometimes, the wind's interventions were almost playful. A letter would slip from beneath a cushion and float to her feet, or a door left slightly ajar would swing inward just as she approached, revealing a hidden envelope. Even in moments when she was not seeking clues, the wind seemed to act on its own initiative, arranging circumstances so that she could gather evidence without revealing her suspicions. Each intervention was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to the protagonist, it became clear that she was not alone in her pursuit of justice. The stepsister's frustration grew with each subtle thwarting. She would discover a letter she thought hidden now resting conspicuously on a table, or witness a page that had vanished from her view reappear in the hands of the protagonist. The wind's presence, though invisible, became a source of tension and fear. She could feel the subtle brush of air against her skin at moments when she least expected it, and though she could not explain the sensation, a growing sense of unease gnawed at her confidence. Every action she took seemed accompanied by this quiet observer, this unseen force that refused to be fooled by her cunning. The wind's alignment with justice became even more evident as time passed. Whenever the stepsister's schemes threatened to cause real harm or create confusion that might be irreversible, the wind intervened decisively, though still without noise or drama. A letter would slip from a hidden compartment at a critical moment, revealing the manipulation. A carefully folded page would unfold, exposing the truth to those who would notice. These interventions, though subtle, shifted the balance, ensuring that the innocent protagonist remained aware and prepared, while the stepsister's sense of control began to crumble imperceptibly. The protagonist, understanding the wind's role, began to trust its guidance. She did not rely solely on it, but incorporated its subtle cues into her observations. If a letter moved unusually or a door seemed to invite her notice, she approached with patience and care, cataloging every anomaly, every clue. Her awareness grew sharper, her confidence steadier. The wind, in its mysterious way, became both ally and teacher, demonstrating that justice, though often unseen, could act with precision and inevitability. By the end of this period, the presence of the whispering wind had transformed the dynamics of the household in subtle but profound ways. The stepsister, though still confident in her manipulations, could no longer ignore the odd occurrences that undermined her efforts. The protagonist, guided by patience and careful observation, had begun to sense that the unseen force was aligned with her, protecting her, and preparing the ground for eventual revelation. In this quiet, mysterious manner, the wind became more than a natural phenomenon. It became a symbol of unseen justice, a harbinger of consequences for those who sought to manipulate and harm the innocent. The household remained unaware of this subtle power, continuing in its routines, caught in tension and intrigue. But in the corners, along corridors, and in the gentle currents that whispered through rooms, the protagonist and the wind shared an unspoken alliance. It was a silent force, patiently guiding her toward truth and eventual vindication, ensuring that the stepsister's schemes would not succeed indefinitely. In every fluttering letter and swaying curtain, there was a promise. Injustice, no matter how cleverly hidden, could not remain concealed forever. The day began like any other, with the household bustling through familiar routines. Servants carried trays, cleaned the corridors, and whispered among themselves, unaware of the quiet tension that had been mounting for weeks. The protagonist moved through these spaces with her usual poise, calm and diligent, her eyes subtly scanning for anomalies, her mind cataloging patterns. She was not aware of when the wind first began to act on her behalf, but that morning, its presence became unmistakable. A gentle current stirred through the hallway, brushing against her skin in a way that felt deliberate, almost guiding. It started with a letter she had long suspected to be missing. The stepsister, confident in her manipulations, had intercepted it the previous evening, believing it safely hidden. She had tucked it beneath a pile of linens, thinking no one would notice until it was too late. But the wind, invisible yet perceptive, nudged the parchment ever so slightly, until it slipped from the pile and fell at the protagonist's feet. She bent down, her fingers brushing the edge of the letter, and felt an immediate jolt of recognition. This was no ordinary correspondence. It bore the king's seal, and the timing confirmed her suspicions. The subtlety of the wind's intervention was crucial. There was no dramatic whirlwind or overt spectacle, nothing that would alert the stepsister or the household at large. Instead, it guided the letter gently, ensuring it would be discovered at the perfect moment. The protagonist's eyes widened slightly as she picked it up, carefully examining the seal and the inked lines. The words within confirmed instructions and praise meant specifically for her, words that should have been delivered days earlier. The reality of the situation became clear. The stepsister's interference had been exposed, if only partially, by this unseen force. The protagonist did not immediately confront her stepsister. Instead, she allowed the moment to unfold with measured calm. She walked through the household, the letter clutched delicately in her hands, and allowed it to be seen by the head of the household who had once doubted her diligence. The recipient of this small, deliberate revelation raised an eyebrow, noting the incongruity between the current situation and prior assumptions. The letter, guided by the wind, had created a bridge between the invisible sabotage and visible acknowledgement, leaving a hint of doubt in the minds of observers about who had truly been at fault. Meanwhile, the stepsister, absorbed in her own sense of triumph, noticed nothing at first. She continued with her routines, intercepting other letters and ensuring that the protagonist remained blamed for minor mistakes. But gradually, she began to perceive an undercurrent of uncertainty in the household. Servants glanced at the protagonist differently, the head of the household asked questions that seemed more pointed, and whispers of confusion began to circulate. The wind's intervention, though subtle, had sown the first seeds of recognition. Someone else, invisible but present, was ensuring that truth could not remain hidden forever. The protagonist, understanding the significance of this first act, chose her response carefully. She did not boast or complain, nor did she reveal the full extent of her knowledge. Instead, she allowed the letter to circulate naturally, letting others observe its presence and its implications. In doing so, she maintained her dignity and patience, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Her composure in the face of subtle vindication only heightened her quiet authority, reinforcing her reputation as a careful and competent figure, even when under scrutiny. As the day progressed, the wind's presence became a faint but perceptible pattern. It seemed to linger near areas where injustice had occurred, drifting around corners, curling through hallways, and brushing past those who had acted unfairly. It did not strike or punish directly, but its guidance allowed the protagonist to discover hidden truths. She noticed a faint movement of paper beneath a bench, a slight flutter at the edge of a curtain, or the subtle lift of a folded note that had been concealed. Each intervention revealed more of the stepsister's duplicity, though in a manner so quiet and deliberate that it could easily be dismissed by those not paying attention. The stepsister's unease grew incrementally. She began to sense that her schemes were no longer entirely under her control. Objects she had carefully hidden were appearing in ways she could not explain, letters she had thought secured were surfacing at critical moments, and subtle hints of observation seemed to follow her. She moved through the household with a growing sense of discomfort, though she could not yet name its source. The wind, invisible and patient, was turning her confidence into anxiety, guiding the protagonist toward awareness and eventual vindication. This first intervention became a turning point. The protagonist realized that she was not alone in her quest for justice. The wind, acting as both observer and subtle agent, had provided her with proof of the stepsister's interference, while simultaneously teaching her patience and careful strategy. She understood that each small act of revelation was part of a larger pattern, a gradual unveiling that would culminate in a full exposure of deceit. She also recognized that the wind's interventions were measured, precise, and purposeful, ensuring that justice would be revealed without unnecessary spectacle or harm to the innocent. By the end of the day, the household had begun to shift. Though most members still moved with the usual routines, a subtle change in perception was palpable. The protagonist held her head high, the king's letter secure in her hands, while the stepsister moved with a quiet tension that had not been there before. The invisible wind had acted decisively for the first time, exposing one act of deceit and setting in motion a chain of awareness that could not be easily ignored. In its quiet, deliberate way, it had signaled the beginning of justice, revealing that even the smallest acts of malice could not escape the notice of unseen forces aligned with the innocent. This subtle intervention marked the start of a transformation in the household's dynamics. The stepsister's confidence had been shaken, the protagonist's patience reinforced, and the wind's presence acknowledged, if only silently, as a force that observed, guided, and corrected. In the quiet of that day, a powerful lesson had begun to unfold. Deception, no matter how carefully concealed, could be exposed by forces both seen and unseen, and justice, patient and deliberate, could emerge in even the most subtle of ways. The stepsister, once confident in her ability to manipulate events and conceal her schemes, began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The invisible wind, which had intervened subtly before, seemed now to shadow her every move, reminding her, though she could not see it, that her control was no longer absolute. Each day brought new frustrations, small disruptions that defied her expectations. Letters she had intercepted would reappear in unlikely places, messages she had hidden were discovered by careful eyes, and tasks she had tampered with unfolded in ways that revealed her duplicity. She could not explain these occurrences, but a creeping sense of vulnerability began to take root, eroding her confidence. Determined not to be outdone, the stepsister intensified her efforts. Her schemes grew more elaborate and audacious, driven by frustration and desperation. She began to intercept multiple letters at once, hiding some in drawers, others beneath floorboards, and yet others in places where only she could retrieve them. She even attempted to mislead servants into misplacing documents intentionally, believing that adding layers of complexity would shield her from discovery. In her mind, these intricate maneuvers were infallible. Yet the wind, invisible and patient, continued to move subtly around her, ensuring that her manipulations did not go unnoticed. The protagonist, always observant, sensed the heightened tension without yet fully understanding the extent of the stepsister's new tricks. She noted the hurried movements, the sudden whispers among servants, and the small but unmistakable signs of panic in the stepsister's demeanor. Her calm patience remained her greatest asset, allowing her to observe and gather information while the stepsister spun herself deeper into her own web of deceit. Each misstep the stepsister made was amplified by the wind's subtle interventions, creating a chain reaction of errors that the protagonist could detect and quietly record. Even as the stepsister's plans grew more desperate, the wind acted with precision. Letters she had thought hidden would slip from drawers at the perfect moment, documents tucked beneath furniture would find their way into the protagonist's hands, and the faint rustle of paper in the corridors served as an invisible signal that no action, however clever, could remain undetected. These interventions were never dramatic. They did not create chaos, only gentle disturbances that guided the protagonist toward clarity. Each subtle correction by the wind reinforced her sense of quiet power and understanding, while simultaneously unsettling the stepsister. The stepsister's frustration manifested in increasingly reckless attempts to manipulate perception. She would tamper with tasks the protagonist had completed flawlessly, rearranging them to appear flawed. She whispered false reports to other members of the household, attempting to sow doubt and suspicion. She even tried to intercept conversations, diverting messages and creating confusion with the hope that the protagonist would be blamed for delays or errors. Yet the wind, attuned to fairness and aligned with the innocent, continued to counteract these schemes. It nudged papers back into place, guided the protagonist's attention to discrepancies, and ensured that those who observed closely could see the truth emerging. With each failed attempt, the stepsister's panic grew. Her once confident stride became hurried and uncertain. Her words, once smooth and convincing, began to carry subtle cracks of desperation. She could feel the wind's presence in fleeting touches against her skin, in faint drafts that seemed to follow her movements, and in the inexplicable way her careful arrangements unraveled without explanation. Though she could not name the source of these disturbances, They haunted her consciousness, eroding her sense of control and authority. The household itself began to sense the tension. Servants, who had long been accustomed to the stepsister's quiet influence, noticed the subtle but consistent disruptions. Tasks that should have been seamless became fraught with minor but telling inconsistencies. Letters moved unexpectedly, arrangements shifted, and subtle changes occurred that suggested an invisible observer was ensuring fairness. Whispers of confusion circulated quietly among the household, though no one could pinpoint the cause. The stepsister, feeling eyes on her at every turn, grew increasingly paranoid, even as she attempted to maintain her composure. The protagonist, for her part, continued to act with patience and calm. She did not confront the stepsister directly, knowing that a premature accusation would be dismissed or misinterpreted. Instead, she allowed the wind's subtle guidance to work alongside her careful observation. When documents reappeared or tasks were corrected without explanation, she took note, cataloging every anomaly, every instance of interference. She understood that these small but consistent signs were building toward a pattern, one that would eventually expose the stepsister's desperation and deceit. The interplay between the stepsister's escalating schemes and the wind's subtle interventions created a rhythm of tension in the household. Every attempt at manipulation was met with a quiet but effective counteraction. Every misstep, every hurried adjustment, became part of a growing awareness that control was slipping from the stepsister's hands. The invisible wind ensured that while her actions were noticed, the protagonist remained protected, poised, and ready to respond at the right moment. By the end of this period, the stepsister's confidence had eroded significantly. Her once assured schemes now seemed fragile and precarious, each act of desperation revealing cracks that the wind quietly highlighted. Meanwhile, the protagonist's awareness and patience grew stronger. She understood that the wind was not merely a passive force but an ally, subtly guiding her toward truth and justice without exposing her to harm. The stage was set for the inevitable revelation. The stepsister's web of deception, built on envy and malice, was beginning to unravel, and the wind's quiet interventions ensured that fairness would ultimately prevail.